After interviewing billionaires, decamillionaires, Fortune 500 CEOs, and #1 New York Times bestsellers, I found the pattern. What do all successful people have in common? Persistence. And to be honest, and full disclosure, I have a Robert Frost poem literally tattooed on my arm. The end stanza of Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. It reads, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." Now, why, you may ask, would I tattoo something of such length on my arm? The answer is this. It acts as a reminder, a mantra, a way of living, a standard to live up to. No matter the woods of our lives, no matter the experiences we face, be they lovely, dark, or deep, I must persist. I must never stop because I have promises to keep. And as the next problem arises, no matter, I have miles to go before I sleep. And then, how about another problem? Miles to go before I sleep. And another? I don't care. Miles to go. Another Frost quote is this one. The best way out is always through. Obviously, he was pretty obsessed with persistence, the keeping on of life, an existential tenacity. And thus, I've tattooed it on my arm. Make me a persistence expert, this does not, but it does, I hope, prove the seriousness of the lessons to come. Because here's the thing, persistence is really just a fancy word for setting standards for yourself. It's about not giving up. Although that sentiment is great and true, you definitely shouldn't give up. It's so non-specific as to render it meaningless, basically mute. We've heard it so often and so much that its juice is now lost in the great noise of forgettable platitudes. Don't give up. Yeah, whatever. Let me through. Point is that persistence isn't about upward ticks in motivation. It's not about rah-rah speeches before the big game. It's not about clawing when you obviously have to because you have to make payroll. It's about setting incredibly clear standards for yourself and then refusing to live below those standards, which may seem a bit confusing, so let me articulate it this way. Imagine you're in a, knock on wood, terrible situation where someone said that if you didn't run a marathon tomorrow, something bad would happen to your mom or your dad or your spouse or your child. What would you do? Well, I think it's obvious. You'd run the marathon because what is the alternative? You'll be crazy tired. Your body would want to quit. Your mind would want to quit. You're in theory not capable of doing this. And yet, despite your lack of training, you would persevere. You would persist despite the pain, despite the anguish. You would go so far beyond anything that you thought was immediately possible because the stakes were so high, because you set an unbreakable standard for yourself. If you tried to run a marathon and if you quit halfway through, nothing of consequence normally happens, which then why not quit, right? Maybe you get a bit of a bruise to your ego, but nothing too big. You weren't training anyway. So what's the difference between quitting and not quitting? What makes you continue in one case despite all the odds compared to the other case where you quit easily? What would keep you well up into the night, wake you up early in the morning? What would be an unquenchable thirst? How do you create the metaphorical air that you must absolutely breathe no matter what, lest you die? It's a standard. Tony Robbins, the self-development guru of our time, famously talks about this very sentiment. He's often asked, how are you like that? How are you always so positive, successful? Do you ever have a bad day? And his answer is always the same. You think I was born this way?
Common question I've been asked by the media my entire life that always makes me laugh is, well, don't you have bad days? Don't you have days when you're like frustrated, excited, and pissed off?
Pointing his thumbs at himself. No, I made this guy. And that's absolutely 100% true for everyone. If you have a computer or a smartphone, the internet can speak and understand English at this level, then your life is now officially your decision. It's a series of choices. It's a series of demands you make upon yourself. It's a standard. See, here's the thing. Your instinct is to resist this idea because it is so much easier to blame everyone else and everything else on everything that happens to you. It's super easy, super incredibly, obviously easy. Everyone does this all the time. We all do it at times. What's difficult instead is to figure out how everything is instead your fault. How everything is a standard that you set for yourself. If you're late all the time, that's your standard. If you're always 10 minutes early, that's your standard. If you wake up whenever you want, that's your standard. If you wake up early to go to the gym, that's your standard. If you're okay with making 50K, that's your standard. 100K, that's your standard. 1 million, that's your standard. If you're okay with working with someone else, that's your standard. For someone else, that's your standard. That you must work for yourself and own a business, that's also a standard. That you take public transportation, a standard. That you drive a fancy car everywhere, that's your standard. Do you say please and thank you? Standard. Do you not eat off of the floor? Standard. Do you open the door for others? Do you give up your chair to the elderly or the sick? Would you ever kill an innocent person? No, that's because you have a standard for not killing innocent people. You see where this is going? My point is that we persist or we don't persist relative to the standards that we're willing to live down to or up to. If you're willing to live in a tent in the woods and that's cool with you, then you probably won't persist in making the next sales call because who cares? You like the tent in the woods. Though if your standard is that you must have enough money in the bank to be able to buy your fiance or your mom or your dad that beautiful house that they want and deserve because they believed in you when no one else would, then you'll most likely continue keeping on. Once again, because the stakes are high enough, because your standard standard is a refusal to fail. So what does that mean for your everyday existence? It means that if you want to persist, you need to set a standard for yourself so high that anything below that standard is not a possible option. Because wherever you are and whatever you do, whether you persist or whether you fight on, it's all a decision. The only difference is whether you're okay with your reason. Yeah, I stopped halfway through. Yeah, I could have finished, but I hit a snag. Yeah, I was doing well, but then the market crashed. These are stories you tell yourself when the stakes aren't high enough. Remember, if your family's health was on the line, hitting a snag is just a small sidestep, nothing to worry about. You'd continue anyways. In fact, one of my favorite stories I've ever heard was from one of my virtual mentors, Brian Johnson. He talks about how heroes don't sidestep small lizards. They don't get upset about today's bump in the road. Instead, they slay dragons. So are you going to slay a dragon? Will you set a standard for yourself so high that there's no room for failure? Because if you do, then persistence will become irrelevant. It's just who you are. The ups and downs of motivation, a distant memory. The inspirational speeches of don't quit, completely unnecessary. Because persistence is great, but what's even greater is doing something so important that you don't need persistence in the first place. Because now it's just who you are. How did you get to where you are, they'll ask. And you'll proudly answer, thumbs pointing back at yourself, I made this guy. So take control of your life. Ditch the excuses and blaming everyone else. Set sky-high standards that scare you and excite you. Find your compelling why and refuse to settle. Write it down and claim it. Then just make a decision to become the person that you aspire to become. It's that simple. Hope that helped. Thanks for listening. Until next time, cheers.